If you were a juror on this case, you got educated on cryptocurrency, terrorist financing, and also the Syrian civil war and this group that you never heard of as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and their military training operation with Mohammed Tactical. So that was a lot for them to digest.
Hello and welcome to Public Key. This is your host, Ian Andrews. This episode is part of our Live from Link series. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be dropping double the Public Key goodness. That's right, new episodes 2 times a week. Interviews with the best speakers from the 2024 edition of the Chainalysis Links Conference. Today, we're going deep into a fascinating case of cryptocurrency, terrorist financing, and jihadist attacks on American soil that is still making news headlines in New York City and all over the world. My guests are David Stewart, who's chief of the counterterrorism unit in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Ed Burns, who's the assistant district attorney, also with the Manhattan DA's office, and Dan Hessman, who's the intelligence research specialist with the NYPD. They tell us the story of discovering that a resident of New York was sending money abroad and corresponding with notorious terrorists. Eventually, they arrested and recently convicted Victoria Jacobs. They walk through the challenges of presenting technical evidence in court and the surprising defense strategy used by the defendant. This gripping episode sheds light on the intersection of crime, cryptocurrency, and counterterrorism efforts, and the persistence and collaboration law enforcement and the district attorney's office have to utilize in order to bring these criminals to justice. Last thing before we dive into the episode, if you weren't able to attend the Chainalysis Links Conference in New York, well, you missed a fantastic event. But not to worry, the Links digital experience is now available on demand. As an attendee, you'll get to see the best content from the in-person conference, plus some special digital-only content. Whether you're in the Americas, EMEA, or Asia Pacific, you'll have the opportunity to live chat with compliance, investigation, and business strategy experts, while receiving an exclusive hands-on view into our latest features. You can register now by clicking on the link in the show notes. Hey everyone, we've got a group for this one, folks. I'm joined by David Stewart, who's chief of the counterterrorism unit in Manhattan DA's office, Edward Burns, who's assistant district attorney in the Manhattan DA's office, and Dan Hessman, who's intelligence research specialist, NYPD. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Yeah, great to be here.
Now, maybe we can just run down the line here, starting with you, Ed. Quick background, 30 seconds to a minute. Why are you here at the crypto conference? What do you do? What's your day job? Like, how does this all fit together?
So I've been at the Manhattan DA's office since September of 2005. I've worked my way up through various bureaus. I did works in narcotics, white collar crime, and joined the Rackets Bureau, which houses Dave's unit in counterterrorism, back in 2022. And once I got there, I was assigned to help out Dave in his really interesting case, they told me, called The People versus Victoria Jacobs. And that's how I got involved in this cryptocurrency world.
Amazing.
Sure. I'm Dan Hessman. I'm an intel research specialist with the NYPD, and I'm a Queens kid, born and raised, and so came out of college, figured out what I wanted to do, and I thought the NYPD seemed like a good place to go. Family in civil service, and just figured out be the best place to go. So that's how I ended up here. I've been here for almost 7 years now. It's scary to think about. And even though I'm not a math person by heart, back in 2019, we decided we wanted to do more in financial crimes, and they needed a couple of people. And I said, well, in 4th grade, a nun made me cry at the blackboard because I couldn't do long division, but I'll be your point person.
Financial crimes, I can take that on. But it's obviously gone reasonably well since then.
I would say so.
You're still here, right?
So my name's Dave Stewart. I'm a California kid who somehow ended up in New York, and I've been at the Manhattan DA's office now for around 17 years.
Wow.
I'm currently chief of the counterterrorism unit, but I've done a little bit of everything throughout the office over that time, working in the trial division, doing sex crimes cases, human trafficking, organized crime like La Cosa Nostra mafia cases, and now I've been doing counterterrorism cases for the past 5 or 6 years, which have been really fascinating insights into the way people think about the world and what motivates them.
Well, I definitely want to get into that. The three of you literally just came off stage before jumping in here to record with us, presenting at the conference. Just before we jump into the crux of this terrorist financing and crypto case, let's quickly listen in on the main stage where Alvin Bragg, who's the district attorney for Manhattan, and Rebecca Weiner, the deputy commissioner intelligence and counterterrorism at the NYPD, discuss the importance of the collaborative efforts of both departments to bring the criminal financing terrorism via cryptocurrency to justice. Rebecca highlights when the NYPD first started focusing on crypto in their investigations and how that encompassed much of their terrorist financing cases.
Being very forward thinking and forward leaning in our approach to cutting edge threats. So from NYPD's perspective, it was around 11 years ago that we started focusing on crypto. It was popping up in our detective bureau cases, it was popping up in ours. But in the terrorism world, it was relatively niche. You're going to hear about a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Syria-based, formerly al-Qaeda aligned group that adopted crypto as a modality for financing early on. Hamas also was a kind of thought leader in the unfortunate incarnation of that word in crypto cases. And now it's just become ubiquitous. Every terrorist organization that is working is using crypto for financing. It's become the defining mechanism of choice, and you're going to hear a little bit about that from Ed Burns. This particular investigation is an international crypto investigation that plays out at a very local level, which goes back to the partnership between the DA and us. Local crimes affecting New York City. And what we've seen over the last few years in our department is the expertise, which is born out of the crucible of really dealing with threats from the terrorism environment that involve crypto, has then spread out into the world of traditional crime.
Crypto has some amazing use cases, but just like any other financial product, criminals, including those perpetrating terrorism, will soon use this technology as part of their attacks. Now let's go back to the trio in the studio at Lynx to walk us through this case. Who wants to take us through the high level of what this case was, the People versus Victoria Jacobs?
I'll start at a high level, and then maybe Dan and Ed can kind of jump in and fill in the gaps or the details. At the highest level, you have a woman who lived in New York City who became immersed, right, within terrorist online ecosystems in Syria and other places, and essentially became obsessed with doing jihad. And one of the ways that she could do that was to finance and launder money for these groups overseas. And what we found is that she ultimately sent and laundered over $12,000 over a 9-month time period in 2008 and 2019. But she didn't stop there. She then sent the group bomb making instructions so that they could make IEDs and kill people with them. And she also acquired illegal knives here in New York City and told people that she was planning a special mission to carry out behind enemy lines. And I think code for her enemy lines was people right here in New York City. So very scary, dangerous individual, and thanks to kind of NYPD and the rest of the team, we were able to make an arrest and charge her and ultimately convict her of terrorism crimes after a 3-week jury trial just this last January.
What was the tip or the lead that exposed this? Like, how did it all start that, hey, maybe we have somebody here who's doing some really bad stuff?
Yeah, so essentially part of the financial crimes portfolio is reading federal compliance data and kind of making sense of that. And a lot of times it's just a lot of, I want to say, just narrative, right? There's this person did X, this person did Y. In this case, we had someone that was in New York that, I think this is notable for the crypto folks here because she was using a nested service. So the filer that filed this report was not the company she was using. She was using a service underneath that company. That was kind of like a contracted service.
Okay.
And so I think she was trying to be savvy by going outside of U.S. jurisdiction area to send this money, but in fact, the parent company that was providing the backbone was compliant with U.S. laws. And so, reading through this report, and I said, well, this is not going to work out for us initially because we're here in New York and this company is based elsewhere. But then you read, okay, they actually are compliant, we can make this work. So, after doing the initial tracing, the workup on the subject, we came over to Dave, and I don't even think we had Reactor at the time because this is so early on to our adoption of cryptocurrency. And I had a piece of paper, I said, all right, so these are cryptocurrency transactions from someone on the Upper East Side that ended up in Syria. I know it's far-fetched, but you think we'd make this work. And it worked from there, right? You know, I think for the folks on the law enforcement side, pitching to the prosecutors is one of those things that you don't do until you know that there's a chance that this case could go to trial. And for us, that's a fairly high bar.
So the funny part about it is that prior to Dan walking into our office and pitching into this case, we had been doing a lot of terrorism financing work involving Syria. So we were very familiar with how Syrian terrorists were financing their operations there, especially how they use cryptocurrency. And we had done a lot of tracing and graphing using chain analysis at the very early stages of an entity that was an exchange in Syria called Bitcoin Transfer. And it turns out that the individual individual that Dan King walked into our office was an unknown wallet that we had known about within that cluster and tracing graph. And it wasn't until Dan had kind of unpeeled the layers of that onion and identified it that we were able to see where she fit within the grander scheme of things.
Wow.
Kind of so much like he was going from the top down, we were going from the bottom up, and it kind of just went right in the middle.
I'm very much not familiar with Syrian terrorist fundraising practices. What's the scale of that? Are there a lot of people in the United States who are sending money to support those types of causes? Is this a widespread thing or a high dollar value thing?
Not high dollar value amount.
Okay.
No, but there are a lot of cases that we've seen come out in the past, 3 years probably, right?
Yeah.
The FBI obviously heading the majority of them, but it's there. It's a real present danger that people think that they are here in the U.S. and that they can't travel there, but they can support them financially. And they know a lot of times exactly what they're sending the money for.
These groups mostly earn their money from local taxation, right? Extortion rings in other ways. Like for us, the more interesting part of it is who are the people here that are so infatuated with these groups, radicalizing that they're willing to send money to these groups. Right. So those are people that we're worried about from a kind of mobilization of violence scenario. Obviously want to prevent them from financing terrorism, even if it's low dollar amounts, but obviously very concerned that this is the type of person that's going to take that next step. So we want to identify them.
And I think what you just touched upon, like with the dollar amount, is I would anticipate seeing major dollar amounts move through in this area, just like in any other, comparing other previous crimes that we've investigated. As money laundering and compliance and other regulatory bodies, they know that a certain threshold is going to alert everybody up. It helps these groups to do smaller dollar amounts. And you see that in money laundering, or even like the basic people avoiding their currency transaction reports by doing multiple deposits under the $10,000 threshold. Sure. So I think one thing that I've learned here is like, you're not going to find one group in an organized way maybe moving millions of dollars, but instead you could have dozens of people moving $10,000 amounts. And then maybe not in an organized way, but the money is still getting there, but it's just going in small amounts to sort of avoid detection and keep us off the trail.
No, that's fascinating. Take us back to the case. So you realize that you've been mapping this organization from the top down. We've discovered a wallet belonging to an individual living here in Manhattan that's been sending money to this organization. What happens next?
Dan and I were at the initial stages, right? Like working on this case. Yeah. So I will say the first thing we did was started to write legal process to get the records from the exchange that identified her as the person who set up the account that sent the initial transaction. And then once we knew who she was, kind of get a better sense, right, of who she is and what other accounts she might be using, which then led to a search warrant on her email account. And Dan can jump in and talk about some of the really interesting things that we found.
No, absolutely. So I think to Dave's point, legal process, right? So the subpoenas, right? And those are really useful. And I think one of the things that comes up in investigations of all sorts in law enforcement, but particularly in cryptocurrency and kind of these complex things, is the idea of going down rabbits. And if you continue to go down this rabbit hole, you're not going to come up with anything. It's going to be a dry hole. But in this case, we never, I think, went too far down a rabbit hole without finding something that said, all right, we need additional process here. We need to go further and actually subpoena that next email address or that phone number. Because there's always something there. But essentially in the emails, what we found was that she was communicating with two individuals that when we traced their email addresses back in open source, so this is just simply Googling stuff, we saw that they were prolific HTS and Mohammed Tactical affiliated individuals. The one guy was a German citizen that was fighting there, and he would basically, his byline on his Telegram account was a German mujahid documenting the everyday life of Mujahideen in Sham. And that email was the exact same handle. Yeah. So that was a really interesting piece. And the other guy, Musab Sharkia, and we just touched on this in the presentation, but he was a complete blank hole. We couldn't find anything on his name. It wasn't a real name. We were kind of concerned that it was just someone that was completely unidentified, which would be maybe even worse because that person could be here in the city as well. Right. Or in the US rather. But then we popped in the name to Google and then pulled up a YouTube channel, a Instagram channel, and had all this information on this guy. And we started to realize that, okay, she's actually communicating with these individuals and she wants to send this money. She's not being paid by someone here in the US. It was on her own volition. Yeah. And that was one of those weird ones because up until about, I'd say 6 months into the case, we thought that she was getting paid, or that was one of the possibilities that she wasn't doing this on her own volition. issue. So it was nice to get that intent and say, hey, look, we can start making further investigatory steps.
Well, for us, there was never any question, right, that she was the one that conducted the transactions. One of the hardest parts about doing a terrorism financing case is proving that she intended that the money that she sent was going to support terrorism overseas.
Sure.
And that's why we did those early search warrants, to peel back the layers to see what she was saying to the other individuals that she was sending money to. What was her online activity? And that's when we started finding her Twitter account where she was praising HTS. We found emails where she was talking about coordinating finances in order to do jihad overseas. And at that point, there was no question as to what her intent was. And then that started a whole nother series of events, investigative events that we did, which found even more evidence.
It's really interesting because I think we've seen over the years a number of campaigns where groups were fundraising online, like social media ads basically, but they would mask the true intent. In some cases, not very well masking, but it's like donate to help orphan children who have been caught in the war in Syria. But if you looked like one step closer, it was like very clearly going to Hezbollah or one of the other militant organizations, ISIS, operating in the region. So it's interesting that you were able to find this like very direct intent where there wasn't even a veil of, oh, I'm sending money to help something innocuous and not harmful. It's like, I'm here to fund terrorist activity.
I mean, in some ways we got lucky, right? I mean,
Yeah.
she was pretty clever online. Like, I mean, obviously we have some great messages and we showed some of them during the presentation and throughout the trial, but that was just a fragment or a fraction, right, of her overall communications with terrorists overseas. We only got bits and pieces, right?
Yeah.
Just looking over her phones, she had 3 years worth of communications with these guys, and we only had bits and pieces that she either forgot to delete or chose to save on her phones for whatever reason.
Did she use a real identity with the crypto exchange when you subpoenaed there, or was it?
Yes.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, she
Interesting.
did, yeah. But for her wallet, though, she used a non-custodial wallet, and
Okay.
she did not use her real name. She didn't have to use any name,
Sure.
right? There was zero KYC that was required, right,
Yeah.
for her to set up that wallet, and she knew that.
Yeah.
So it was very much a circumstantial case in some ways because we had a lot of evidence that pointed to her, some more direct than others, but it was just the overall amount and volume of evidence that identified her. And in fact, her defense at the trial, at least up to 3/4 of the way through, was that it wasn't her at all. That someone else had assumed her identity, right, and conducted all of these transactions, that someone else had been the one that communicated with these terrorists, which was so asinine because we literally found pictures of the terrorists on her phones. And pictures that she had spliced of herself in with the terrorists to show that they were like in some sort of relationship.
And I, sorry, not to interrupt, but I want to take from the CT side of things to give you a little background on Mohammed Tactical. The individual, Salman Belarus, that he's talking about, he was a guy that during the Syrian civil war, he was prolific for his operational security. You could not find a picture of him out there without his mask on. He always was masked up. And to the point where he actually faked his own death at one point during the Syrian civil war and then reemerged as another guy, Abu Rofik. Or rather, the other way around, it was Rofik and then he became Abu Salman. So the fact that when we went on these phones and we found pictures of him just lounging around the barracks having a Coca-Cola, we're like, oh, they really were close communicating partners.
Was there a romantic relationship? It sounds like maybe
Semi-romantic relationship.
they didn't meet in person, so there was no.
Hard to
it was
say
all
exactly
electronic.
what
I would say,
was.
as someone who came in late and is adjusting to all of this, at first it struck me a little odd, but I think in like this day and age, there are people that they would call a relationship where they never meet. And It's a true romantic relationship where they're purely online, knowing that they were never going to meet. And remember, it was an impossibility. She was never going to get to Syria. That was an impossibility of it. So it allowed it to kind of like just continue in this way. And it was something that I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. And then when you took it into that sort of context of like, no, people do have these online relationships, it made it a little bit more reasonable. I think Dave said like, oh, we were lucky. And that's true of any criminal investigation. Luck plays a part of it, but you can say that about anything in life. The question is like, are you working hard enough and are you being vigilant enough that when your break comes along, are you there to take advantage of it and discover it? And that's what these guys were doing. They could have turned around at any time and been like, this is crazy, or this is not that much money, but they kept going because they're like, this should be something there. And by doing so, you uncovered a very dangerous person operating in New York City for a very bad group. I think that was a key part that I just want to say, like, it's easy to sell ourselves short sometimes, be like, oh, luck had a lot to do with it. Well, you still kept going, and you still persevered, and you still had the analysts, so you kind of made your own luck in that way.
One more quick break to share an old saying. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And when asked what really brought this case home for the prosecution, Alvin Bragg highlighted the persistence and diligence of the career prosecutors and the law enforcement working with experts to tie all of this together and then tell a compelling story in court.
So I would say, our career prosecutors working hand in hand with the NYPD, which also has considerable expertise here, it's persistence, which we see in other areas too, but here really persistence to connect the dots. This is someone who is, right here, for those who know Manhattan, right here on the Upper East Side, a very residential area, from comfort of home, reaching out, using our financial markets, reaching out across the world to finance terrorism. It is using both our financial markets, which obviously we're known for here in Manhattan. It's using the cryptocurrency technology. It's laundering money through those channels. And so it's the diligence of the career prosecutors and the law enforcement working with experts to tie all of this together. So people often ask, what did the case come down to? It's all of that being woven together. It's that web, and it's the diligence and persistence of those with great expertise like the prosecutors here, our investigators, and the NYPD to knit all this together to then tell a compelling story to the jury. And this is one that obviously, we're drawing our jury pool from Manhattan, deep interest in this issue, I'm sure.
Back to the episode where David adds a couple of interesting facts about the case and the Manhattan DA's office.
Ed, I'm sorry. I'm just so glad you brought that up. And I just want to add 2 short points in.
Absolutely.
And this was evidence at the trial, so it's no surprise to anybody. She claimed to be Belarus's fiance. I mean, we don't have any evidence they ever got engaged, but she obviously viewed herself in her own mind as having that kind of romantic relationship with him. And 2, to Ed's point, I'm so glad he brought it up. At the DA's office in Manhattan, we are the only local DA's office in the entire country that I know of that has a dedicated team for counterterrorism cases. We have 4 full-time analysts who are experts in all things terrorism, and we have dedicated investigators, and we work with NYPD's team, which is even bigger than ours, and have similar expertise. But it was so important for us as prosecutors to understand the landscape, because otherwise, when a case like this walks in, if we hadn't been prepared at the outset, we would have had no idea how to handle it.
One quick point. We talk about low dollar amount cases.
Yeah.
And I think that at the state and local level, people that are looking at cryptocurrency crimes and cryptocurrency enabled crimes, they should pursue these small dollar amount cases because you never know where it's going to lead. And at the federal level, they may say, well, we don't have the resources to pursue $500, but
Right.
we do at the local.
I love this story and the point you're making about having people with the expertise to investigate digital aspects of a crime, because I talk to a lot of people from around the country, and I think that's their biggest challenge is they have a big caseload, they have maybe one expert investigator who's catching everything, and they can't follow everything through. So it's terrific that you've got a broader set of resources here, particularly on topic with the urgency of counter-terrorist finance.
Yeah, and cryptocurrency, and I should do a shout out to the lab. We have probably one of the most preeminent digital labs in the country.
Quick interruption again. When we spoke to Alvin, he highlighted the innovative tactics used by criminals when it comes to terrorism, public corruption, gun or narcotics trafficking, and how his office has made sure to develop expertise and rely on experts in the space of digital forensics, cryptocurrency, and other technology in order to ensure that bad actors can't hide behind technology to commit crime.
Interesting thing, and we see this across a range of subjects, and I've now seen this across a range of years. People who are interested in engaging in wrongdoing, whether it's terrorism, public corruption, gun or narcotics trafficking, are often innovating and using different forms of technology, and our law enforcement tools have to stay up to date to detect and to stop that conduct. And cryptocurrency is, the one that we're talking about a lot now because there are people who are seeking to do wrongdoing. And so this is something that we have worked on to develop expertise on and also rely on experts so that we can help make sure that people are not able to hide behind technology and do their wrongdoing. In some ways, it's age old. We've been doing this as prosecutors for a long time, and this is one of the latest technologies, and working with experts so we can really make sure that no one can hide behind technology to commit crime.
Now back to the podcast to listen in on David describing how quickly the lab was able to work with the digital evidence from Victoria Jacobs' cell phones.
So when we got those phones in from the search warrant, they were processed and ready to be extracted and analyzed within 24 hours.
Yeah.
That speed at which we're able to do these complex cases and get evidence from cell phones and other devices is unique.
I'm always curious about is you've now got a fairly good picture of the case. It's clear that there's money moving to a terrorist organization. Once you get these email search warrants, you're able to establish like there's intent behind it. Do you immediately go and arrest the individual at that point, or do you surveil them for longer to potentially uncover like a wider network? How do you make a decision on that?
Well, I think, and this is where I can assist in my perspective, it all depends on each case.
Okay.
Here, the best evidence that they recovered was from the cell phones. Any arrest before that would have been, I felt, they made the right choice. They would have been premature. And then there's a whole bunch of things that would have happened. So it really depends on what you get in these cases and evaluating like what strength you are. I think it's always a good idea. Like, do not make an early arrest unless you absolutely need to. Make sure you have all your evidence. If you're banking on getting evidence
Through the arrest,
that's a difficult challenge.
Yeah.
And that could also impede your investigation, not hurt your chances of success. The key part of why this was successful was a continuing partnership between NYPD and the Manhattan DA's office in how the investigation was going to be taken down, when the arrest was going to occur, the coordination of the search warrant that Dan talked about during his presentation, having the Manhattan DA's, the high-tech analysis unit present so we got the phones, and that she was not able to destroy that evidence because we had anticipation that we weren't going to be able to arrest her. So those sort of steps were key to success, and I think that always a case-by-case basis, but here I think that was clearly the right move.
Yeah. Quick note, the partnership between NYPD and the Manhattan DA was integral to the success of this case. Let's listen to Alvin Bragg as he excitedly explains this partnership and how it was key to the case and many others.
I'm trying to think of the right phrases: hand in glove, hand in hand, peanut butter and jelly. What two things go together? I mean, because that's how this work must happen, right? It is an incredible partnership with the NYPD. When we were at the conference, there with the deputy commissioner, and you mentioned Dan, the intel research specialist from the NYPD. Many areas of our work rely on this kind of partnership. This area in particular, with the intelligence gathering capabilities of the NYPD, their commitment to this, and then really the commitment on both sides to the partnership. More than 20 years ago when I started in law enforcement, and this is one of the best collaborations I've seen.
Back to the podcast where we get to the arrest portion of this case. Once you make the arrest, obviously then you're getting prepared for trial. And I think one of the challenging things about any case where there's digital evidence, but in particular cryptocurrency, it's very technical. And you've got to present that to an audience that they're not spending all day long thinking about crypto. And what's the strategy, whether it's a judge or a jury trial, that you're able to lay out, effectively communicating the facts when they're very technical in nature?
And this is where it was almost helpful that I wasn't involved early on, because these guys were well in the weeds of cryptocurrency, and I had like a loosely affiliated like association. Okay, money launderers use cryptocurrency, narcotics trafficking, a lot of money laundering cases. I was very familiar with that crime.
Yep.
And then I heard cryptocurrency, I'm like, whoa, okay, I don't know. And I had an analyst come down and explain it to me, and I'm like, okay, so that I kind of just remembered hearing how I was able to take that information that she gave me and was able to sit there and be like, okay, that's what we need to do for a jury, because they can understand it. When it boils down to it, it's going to be she's sending money to a bad actor to do bad things. We just got to get the jury not to get lost in the weeds of all this data of what cryptocurrency is. And that was when we used, we were talking to Beth Bisbee and other teams, other people at Chainalysis were assisting us in understanding the transactions and different things. And we kind of really just broke it down and be like, look, we really need to explain this to an uninformed jury pool that doesn't have any familiarity with it. And in fact, it was funny when we were picking our jury, everybody that had a familiarity with cryptocurrency knew about this case and was actually taken off the jury because they had previous knowledge of it. So it was just interesting to be like, it was sort of a small world.
So you got a pre-selected pool basically that had zero knowledge of crypto walking in almost.
I think we had one juror who was like, I know what this is and I know that everyone's going to ask me what is going on, and we didn't want to have competing expert. And it was a very good jury pool. Yeah, sort of like that point. But I think it's just, that's our job as prosecutors, which is what I kind of hit in my presentation. Dave's mentioned that he handled sex crimes. He had to explain DNA evidence.
Right.
I handled narcotics trafficking cases. I would have to explain where the drugs come from, how a heroin is broken down into a heroin mill, other aspects of that. So just like cryptocurrency, terrorist finance is a very big term, but you can like sort of break it down to, we have a defendant here sending money to bad actors overseas to do bad things.
Yeah.
And as long as we kept that sort of focus, the jury was right with us the whole time.
That's amazing. One quick point. Ed mentioned that he was taught about cryptocurrency when being brought into the case in a clear and simple manner. We'll go to Alvin to explain how the prosecution was able to present their case in the same accessible and digestible way. And ultimately, that description of evidence led to a jury deciding in just a few hours.
Dave and Ed showed some of the kind of demonstratives at the conference of sort of the flow of money that was shown to the jury. And notwithstanding the complexity, we're talking about a guilty verdict that was returned within a few hours. And so I think distilling evidence, putting it in a very digestible and understandable way that's ascertainable to a jury is so important, so compelling. It's sort of storytelling. And the story was clearly told in an accessible way here, given that the verdict was returned within just a few hours.
Let's get back to the podcast where David will provide an explanation to the defense team's changing strategy.
Now, I want to go back to something, David, that you mentioned earlier. You said that the defendant changed their defense strategy 3/4 of the way through the trial. They went from saying they had nothing to do with it, their identity had been stolen. What did they change to?
The defense, ultimately, in the summation, because they could not deny that it was her, because the evidence was so strong that she was the one responsible for the communications and the transactions, which is really, I think, a very bad defense. But their defense was, well, the Syrian terrorist group wasn't that bad, right?
Sorry, I have to laugh at that a little bit.
Yeah, well, Syria's a complicated place.
Yeah.
Okay?
Share the name of that lawyer with me later.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make sure to...
Well, I'll give them a break. They had a tough client, and they had to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, Syria's a complicated place. I mean, the group was not only trying to establish their own violent jihadist state within Syria, they were battling against the Syrian regime and also Russia, right? So there were some common enemies that the defense could point to say, hey, they're fighting Russia, we're fighting Russia, so maybe they're not that bad. But at the end of the day, the two wrongs don't make a right, and this was a bad group, regardless of the fact that they were also fighting countries like Russia and the Assad regime in Syria.
In a way, if you were a juror on this case, you got educated on cryptocurrency, terrorist financing, and also the Syrian civil war and this group that you never heard of as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and their military training operation of Muhammad Tactical. So that was a lot for them to digest.
Just pronouncing that would kill me right there.
It took me very long to get those down. And I still don't know if I'm right.
And then just to wrap the story, the conviction was just handed down recently. You want to tell that story?
I think, Dave gave a great summation that really covered the whole entire breadth of her criminal activity from the start.
Yeah.
And the jury was given the case, I think, very early on, and within 3 hours. I think Dave said it was 3 weeks. I feel like it was a 4-week trial. I think because jury selection took a week, and we had 3 weeks of testimony.
4-week trial.
4-week trial, and they deliberated for less than 3 hours and convicted the defendant on all counts.
Congratulations.
It's great to hear such a great ending to a lot of hard work from both the Manhattan DA and the NYPD. Congratulations to both. But many will ask, what about sentencing? Well, after this podcast was recorded, we actually spoke to the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, who you've heard scattered throughout this podcast. He was kind enough to provide us with the details of the sentencing and the intricacies of the judge's decision.
I'll maybe pick it up from where they left off. I think when they were talking to you, we just had a guilty verdict, handed down relatively quickly. It was a complex case, as we mentioned, a guilty verdict after just a few hours of diligently evaluating all the evidence and the testimony, and the sufficient time to review the evidence wasn't a few minutes, right? It was a few hours to review the evidence, but that fact that it was within a few hours and not a few days, I think talks about the strength of the case. I will say that having tried a number of cases to juries, I think I've learned enough to know not to speculate. One never knows, and so you just answer the jury notes as they come out. Try not to speculate a ton as to what they mean. You await word from the jury, and here we got it in the form of a guilty verdict, which we think was the fair and just outcome. And then after that, the next stage after the trial is the sentencing. So last month, they were back in court. The sentencing stage argued for a 20-year prison sentence, and ultimately the judge sentenced the defendant to 18 years in prison, be followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. We thought it was the fair and appropriate amount of time based on the charges. What we do is look at the offense conduct and obviously the background of the defendant, and then we look at analogous, to the extent there is an analogous case, of federal and state terrorism cases, and look at them on the sort of a spectrum. So we thought 20 years was commensurate with the conduct as compared to other sentences that have been handed down in federal and state court. But that's our process. We're looking at every case on its merits. And unfortunately, in this region here in Manhattan, we have had a number of cases to draw upon to sort of look at comparable data points. And so looking at all of them, we thought the 20-year recommendation was fair and appropriate. But our work in this area never stops, right? We are vigilant and mindful of our expertise here and trying to bring it to bear in this area. And so while the sentencing in this case has concluded, our work in the space, sadly, must continue and will continue. You see the kind of expertise and the commitment of resources from the office to this. So the work continues.
Wow. Lots for a judge and the prosecution to think about. It's great they got to close with the outcome they were hoping for. And now to the ending of the podcast.
Big win for a great effort here. So, gentlemen, thank you for coming to Links. Thank you for sitting here with us on the podcast and sharing this success. Here's to many more in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to another episode. If you enjoyed what you heard today, do me a favor. Open up your podcast app, rate the show. Give us a review. Tell us what you liked. Even better, you can share the podcast with your friends. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Much like fiat currency, crypto has been used in connection with scams, ransomware, money laundering, child exploitation, terrorist financing, sanctions evasion, and darknet market commerce. Law enforcement, more than ever, need to learn how to investigate crypto-related crime, and our new white paper provides a comprehensive guide on how cryptocurrency works and where crypto and crime intersect, and how to leverage blockchain intelligence to investigate crypto-related crime. We even showcase how law enforcement agencies are already successfully fighting crypto crime. So head down to the show notes to download the white paper today.